So good morning and afternoon to everyone. I'm Sharon Goldberg. I'm the CEO and co-founder of BastionZero, which is a company that helps engineers access backend infrastructure, things like servers, containers, clusters, databases. I'm also a computer science professor at Boston University, where I've been teaching for the last 13 years. I teach InfoSec. And the way that this talk came about is I was watching breach after breach happen in 2022. Reddit happened in 2023, actually, Cloudflare, Twilio, Uber, Dropbox. And these were all situations where the victims had MFA in place, but the adversary was still able to attack them even though they had MFA. And this was like a bit of a head scratcher, I think, for everyone in the community, because these are not like naive organizations that don't have, good best practices in place, but yet they're still getting compromised. And it looks like MFA was being exploited. And so my background is in cryptography. I started to try to understand, like, how does MFA actually work and why does it keep getting hacked? And so that's how this talk came about. I did the first version of this talk in my InfoSec class, and now I've been going to a bunch of DevOps conferences to talk to the community about what MFA does, how it works, and how you need to think about it. To start, why should we, if we're DevOps professionals, talk about MFA in the first place? And I would argue that your role in the organization touches things that are obviously, as you know, very, very significant. We just had a talk about software supply chain security, access to your repos, access to your pipelines, access to your production servers, to your production databases, people who are kube controlling into your clusters. All of that stuff is highly sensitive, and it gets compromised. There's a big problem, and that touches DevOps. And one of the ways that we protect these systems is with multi-factor authentication. And so that's why I think that this community does need to have an understanding of how MFA works. So I'm glad you guys are all here with me, and I'll do my best to sort of share what I know and what I've learned and what we figured out at BastionZero. And in particular, this is a very, very dear to our hearts at BastionZero, because what our tool does is it grants access to production infrastructure for engineers, and also CI/CD pipeline access to infrastructure. And we do use MFA in a very strong way in the tool. So we've spent some time thinking about the best way to do this. And nothing I'm going to tell you here is outside of the set of standards that are standard in the industry. I just think that there's a lot of lack of clarity about what these different MFAs do. And so that's what I'm hoping to go into today. Okay, so to get started, why do we need MFA? I think everyone here knows this. We need MFA because passwords are constantly getting compromised. They can be stolen, they can be leaked, they're sold on the dark web, they can be phished. We now have a standard class of attacks called credential stuffing, which sounds really fancy, but all it means is it leverages the fact that people tend to reuse passwords across services. So if they steal your password from a weakly protected website, they may be able to try it at other websites that are unrelated and see if they can access them, right? So someone steals my Facebook password, and if it's the same as my bank password, they might be able to compromise my bank account, right? So that's credential stuffing. And the other issue with passwords is that they're long-lived. Your password stays the same for a long time. In fact, it's a best practice to have people's passwords stay the same for a long time. The reason for that is it allows them to remember it in their heads. If they're constantly having to change their passwords, they'll forget, and then the passwords become weaker. So passwords are long-lived credentials. There are all these risks, and so we need to mitigate the risk that the password gets stolen and that a system gets compromised as a result, right? And so the idea behind MFA is that even if my password is stolen, it's unlikely that the attacker can also steal, the one who stole my password, can also steal my device or my biometrics. So if my password is leaked on the dark web, or stolen from, if you remember that there was a breach of Yahoo many years ago when they stole password files and they cracked all the passwords, right? Cracking all the passwords does not mean that you can also steal my phone, right? Or that you can also steal my phone number, or you can steal my biometric, right? And so just because you stole my password doesn't mean you can steal my MFA, and that's what's going to protect our systems from compromise. So this is a very, very good thing, right? But something went wrong in 2022 where we saw all these breaches. I'm actually interested to know from folks here, I guess maybe we could use a poll, how many people were aware of the sort of like avalanche of MFA breaches in 2022? Or is this like news to you? I'd be interested. I don't know, Darren, if you're able to set up a poll for me live while we do this, but I'd be interested to hear what the community here is aware of. But in any case, we had a large number of breaches in 2022 where they talked about MFA phishing attacks and MFA fatigue attacks. And so what I'll be doing today is talking you through what these things actually are and how they work and how you can stop them. So what's interesting to me is I'm here in the US. I live in Boston. We're a Boston and San Francisco based company. And I'm a professor at Boston University. In 2022, in January, there was a very high profile memo that came out from the US government, moving the US government towards zero trust cybersecurity principles. And in this memo, they actually talk about MFA, and they say something very interesting. They say, the second bullet point over there, you can see, phishing resistant MFA is required. And at the time that I was reading this, I thought, wow, this is like overkill. We don't really need to only use, Webauthn and hardware-based MFA. I actually wrote a blog post saying that this was like overkill, like we don't really need this. And then I ended up being wrong, because in 2022, we just saw this rash of attacks that exploited MFA phishing. And so, I think that we should hand it to the US government for telling us all this in 2022. And I do think that we're going to see a lot of changes in the next year about how organizations do MFA in light of what we've seen. So today we're going to learn about a few different types of MFA, phone-based MFA via phone call or SMS, TOTP MFA, which if you're familiar with Google Authenticator, this is TOTP MFA here that I have on my phone, push-based MFA, and Webauthn, which is the new, some people call this FIDO. Webauthn has a misconception that it's only associated with hardware keys. I'm going to try to disabuse you of this misconception today. And so this is what we'll be talking about. Okay, so these are, I don't know if you've heard of all four of these. I'm certain that everyone has used number one. I would imagine that the majority of folks here have used number two, and the others maybe not so much. So I don't know if, Darren, you're able to do polls for me, if you're up for it, but I'd be interested to hear a poll of like if you've ever used TOTP or Webauthn in your organization. I have TOTP on my phone. I have just like a ton of services that use this type of technology. So what I'll be doing is I'll walk you through each one of these types of MFA, and we'll talk about the risks associated with each. So let's start with phone-based MFA. So phone-based MFA, what we're doing with phone-based MFA is we're proving that you possess a phone number. It is not a proof that you possess a phone, but it's a proof that you possess a phone number. So you can see on my slide there, there's a little screenshot of someone logging into Chase, and they send them a code on their phone via SMS. And then what the user will then do is take the code and type it into the website after they enter their password. And that's the process of doing MFA. Now, this is actually a really, really important type of MFA because it's used in most consumer products. It's actually used by most banks. And the reason for this is because most people in the world know how to use SMS, and they understand this technology and they can use it. And so this is why it's still really popular. For example, Bank of America is exclusively using phone-based MFA, and this is the biggest bank in the US. So, okay. So the problem, though, with phone-based MFA, and the reason that we don't use it is because actually stealing your phone number is easier than you would think. Stealing your phone number is easier than you think. So there are two classes of attacks that you may have heard of, SS7 attacks and SIM swapping attacks, where what happens is the attacker actually steals your phone number, takes your phone number off your phone, and puts the phone number on their phone. And now they're receiving your phone calls and your SMSs, and they can attack you in this way. So I'm going to walk you through a SIM swapping attack, which is something I've actually seen. I've watched this happen to colleagues of mine. It actually is in the cryptocurrency industry was quite common. There were SIM swapping attacks quite a lot a couple of years ago. If everyone remembers Jack, the CEO of Twitter, at the time was, I think, subject to a SIM swapping attack. And this is why they added stronger MFA on Twitter back in those days. So I want to show you what a SIM swapping attack is. And so we can all understand why phone-based MFA is a little bit too weak for business applications today. So let's look at a SIM swapping attack. So a SIM swapping attack is very simple. What the attacker's trying to do is steal your phone number and get their phone number put on their phone. So what they do typically is they collect information about the victim, calls your phone company, and pretends to be you. You know, I lost my phone fell in the toilet, I have a new phone, and then switches the victim's phone number, my phone number, off my phone onto their phone. Okay. And so what happens now is if the attacker gets all your phone calls and texts, right, and they've already stolen your password, then when that MFA comes to your phone, it's actually not going to your phone anymore. It's going to the attacker, and they can impersonate you and log in as you. So this is a classic reason that we don't actually use phone-based MFA in most business applications, because it's too subject to theft of phone number attacks. There's another attack that you may or may not have heard of. There's this technology called SS7. SS7 is the routing protocol of the telephone network. It's very, very old. It's as old as telephones. I don't know how old it is exactly, but it's very, very old. It predates the 90s, very, very old technology. And it is effectively the way that phone carriers route phone calls between themselves. And it's actually well known that SS7 is very, very, very vulnerable to attacks. The main defense of SS7 protecting it from attacks is the fact that it's very hard for adversaries to get on the SS7 network. Once you're on the SS7 network, if you want to behave adversarially, it's actually not that difficult. And so this is one of the reasons why SS7 is a big threat to theft of phone numbers, because if an adversary can compromise SS7, they can basically reroute your phone calls to their phone by compromising the phone routing protocol. And I used to think that this type of attack was really rare, but what has happened over the last years is just like we have ransomware for hire. You can go buy, you know, pre-built ransomware. If you're an adversary, you buy it from a software supplier and use it to do ransoms. There is SS7 effectively like software for hire, attack software for hire that you can find on the internet. It's not very hard to find. And so this is one of the reasons why, you know, theft of phone numbers is something that I think in an organization you should be worrying about. This is not like a far-fetched attack. Okay, so just going back 1 second here, I just wanted to mention that phone-based MFA is also subject to MFA phishing attacks. I will show you an MFA phishing attacks next, because a lot of things are subject to MFA phishing attacks. So let's hold that one, but we'll look at that in a second. Okay, so bottom line with this technology, the pro is it's very easy to use. The con is that it's subject to phishing and phone number theft attacks. Okay, all right, let's go on. So TOTP is actually the protocol that's most popular in most organizations now. And what TOTP does is it actually eliminates this issue of your phone number being stolen, because what you're doing with TOTP is you're not proving possession of a phone number, you're proving possession of a phone, like the physical phone. This is my phone, right? And the reason that this happens is because the way that TOTP works is that you have a key on your phone, in the hardware on your phone, and the thing that you're MFAing to, let's say your identity provider, has a key as well. So you share a key between your phone and the service you're MFAing to. And whenever you need to MFA, what your phone authenticator app will do is it will effectively take that key, it'll take the current time, it will hash that together, and then it will truncate that to get 6 digits, and that's how you get these kinds of codes that you can see on my phone. And that will give you the MFA code. Now, since both the phone and the server here, the IDP, right, have the same key and they know the same time, they can compute the same code, and so they can verify the correctness of the code, and that's how phone-based MFA works. Okay, so why does this eliminate the theft of phone number attacks? Well, because this isn't about my phone number anymore. This is about my physical phone that contains a crypto key that I'm sharing with the server. So if the adversary steals my phone number, it doesn't matter, because they actually have to physically steal my phone. And so this is right because the key is inside this phone, and that's the only place that it is. So this is really cool, right? This sounds great, because what it does is it sort of takes the risks out of the electronic world, where someone's like stealing a password file or putting a keylogger on your machine or something like this, and it takes it into the physical world, where they have to physically get on my phone somehow, or at least compromise my phone, and extract this information in order to attack me and steal my credentials. So this seems really good, right? However, we have a problem, and the problem is phishing attacks. So this is a diagram of an incident that happened at Cloudflare in August. I pulled this off their blog. You can actually go and read the blog, and I just made this slide based on their blog. So here's what happened. There was an adversary that started spamming all of the employees or some amount of employees at Cloudflare with this text message. And this is actually off of Cloudflare's blog post. You can go see this. And it says, your Cloudflare schedule has been updated. Please tap cloudflare-okta.com to view your changes. Okay. Now, what I want you to keep in mind here, they're basically telling the user to go to cloudflare-okta.com, okay, and do something, right? Now, Okta is an identity provider and Cloudflare is their employer. So that web page looks really legit, right? It looks like a reasonable thing to go visit. But what I want you to think about is that web page should really say evil.com, because that web page is a phishing website. It's a fake website that was made up by the adversary and is used to steal credentials from the employees of Cloudflare. So if you clicked on this website, evil.com, right? If the user was seeing this message and actually clicked, they would see a page that looks just like, if you look at it, it looked just like their normal Cloudflare login. And it had, the normal look. And it had the website, cloudflare-okta.com. And so if you thought that this was like a normal thing for you to do, to go in and log in with your username and password, you would do that. So the user would go log in with their username and password, put in their, use their phone, grab the MFA code off their phone, and then put it in. And then what happened? This is not an actual Cloudflare website. This is an adversary's website. So your credentials, your username, your password, and your MFA went straight over to the adversary. What did the adversary do? Take your credentials and log in as you. And now the adversary has actively logged into your account on Cloudflare. They've logged in as you. They've been able to steal your credentials and log in as you. And that's the attack. So now the adversary's in and they can go do whatever they want. Okay. So this is quite a scary attack, right? Because the user was fooled through a classic phishing attack, going to a URL that was actually not a good URL. It was a malicious URL, and putting in their usernames and passwords. But it was done in such a clever way. The URL was sort of well chosen. It looked normal. And people fell for it, and that's how they got hacked. Okay, so if there's any questions on this, please put them in the chat. But I'm gonna, since this isn't super interactive, I'm just gonna go on. But this was like one of the first MFA phishing attacks that was successful, right? And the real, I think innovation here is actually that the URL was so convincing, right? The URL was so convincing. Okay. And you can see that this is something that would happen if you had TOTP on your phone, or you had phone text, text messages to your phone. All of this is the same type of risk for a user. Okay, so just to summarize where we are, phone-based MFA, great for consumers. The cons, MFA phishing and stolen phone number attacks. TOTP-based MFA, better security, right? Good for employees, but the cons are MFA phishing. So if your employees get phished, you have a problem. How many people heard of the, if you've heard of the Uber breach? The Uber breach actually was a different issue. It wasn't a phishing breach. MFA phishing was actually a MFA fatigue attack. So I want to walk you through what an MFA fatigue attack looks like. So, with a push-based MFA, right, the idea is that this time, instead of taking these codes and doing the annoying thing of like finding the code and typing it in, I mean, if anyone's ever done this, it's always stressful. You're going to pick the wrong code. You're going to make a mistake. And so push-based MFA is really cool because you no longer have to look at these annoying codes. You just push a button. As you can see on the screen, right, I get this message and it just says, do you want to accept or deny this request? That was made from acme.onelogin.com. This technology is very similar to the TOTP-based MFA. It can in fact be based on the same tech, but the difference is that now the user is getting these notifications. What I wanted to show you about push-based MFA is it actually has a risk, a separate risk, which is MFA fatigue attacks. And so this is a reproduction of what effectively happened in the Uber breach, as far as we know. So, and I don't know that Uber used OneLogin, by the way. I just used this picture because I found it on the internet and it looked nice. So don't take the OneLogin too seriously. Any sort of push-based MFAs is what I'm trying to indicate here. So we had the adversary actually. Here's an adversary and they've stolen someone's username and password, okay? And what they're doing is they're trying to log in as that person onto the real service, right? So Alice's username and password has been stolen, the adversary has it, and they're trying to log in as Alice, right? So what is the login process? They're logging in, and then as soon as they log in, what happens is they get a push-based MFA gets generated by the identity provider. It goes to the real Alice's phone, and she sees this MFA request, right? And so what happened in the Uber situation was that the adversary kept logging in over and over and over again as the victim, over and over again. And this victim kept getting more and more push-based MFAs to their phone. It was like a push and another push and another push and another push. And eventually, you know, they were clicking deny, 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 deny. And eventually they actually clicked accept. And when they clicked accept, the adversary was actually able to get in. So what they did here was they fatigued the user by constantly bombarding them with the push-based MFA until they accepted it. And this is actually a little snippet of what the adversary claimed to do. It says, I was spamming the employee with push auth for over an hour. Then I contacted him on WhatsApp, claimed to be Uber IT, and told him if he wants it to stop, he must accept it. Well, he accepted it, right? So what happened was the adversary just kept doing this and then basically social engineered the person into accepting the MFA by tricking them into thinking that they were really the real IT department of Uber. Okay, so this is an MFA fatigue attack that is specific to push-based MFA that we started to see. Okay, so now, I actually gave this talk like a week ago, and someone asked me, is push-based MFA subject to phishing attacks? And actually, there was a person in the room who came up with this attack on the fly in my talk, so I just want to show it to you. This is a push-based MFA phishing attack. I'm just going to reproduce the Cloudflare situation where we have the alert, the user logs into the phishing site, and then the adversary gets their credentials. But in a push-based MFA situation, the user would have logged in first with their username and password here, right? Then the adversary would take the username and password, hit the actual site, the actual identity provider with that username and password, and then the push-based MFA would go out to the user, right? Now this user is already in the mindset of logging in because they've put in their username and password. They're getting the push-based MFA, and it would, and then if they fell for actually clicking this accept button, then the adversary would have gotten in. Right? The only difference here in this situation is that if they were paying attention, they would notice that the push-based MFA probably wouldn't be for cloudflare-okta.com because the real website that the adversary is logging in was not this evil.com website. It was actually the real Cloudflare login. And so if the user noticed, this doesn't look like cloudflare-okta.com, they might have been able to avoid pushing the accept, right? But it's kind of tricky because they were probably in the mindset of like, oh, I'm logging in and this is all normal. And so it could be a mistake and someone could push and accept. So there are risks as well associated with push-based MFA in terms of phishing. I wanted to ask you, there was a question on URL-based defense tools. You know, I do think that this is a classic phishing situation, right? When we see things like this, if you have a tool that can protect your users from going to phishing websites, then, you know, that should help here. And in fact, if you read the Cloudflare blog about this story, what they talk about is they talk about actually taking down this site because it was a phishing website. So yes, like URL defenses could help here. Yes. Let's go on to the last technology. So I'm sure that a lot of people have heard about Webauthn or FIDO2 or hardware keys. If you read the Dropbox blog post after they got compromised, they talk about moving to Webauthn. And so I wanted to understand, like, what is Webauthn and how does it work? And why does it protect us against these attacks? I mean, these attacks are so insidious, right? Like, how can we actually stop these attacks? And so what I did was I went and tried to read the Webauthn standard. It's really hard to read. So here is my understanding of how this works. You know, I'm a crypto professor and WebSec person. So there's like some cool tricks in here and they're not so obvious. And I wanted to show them to you. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do in my remaining time. I have still 15 minutes, right? I believe that's the case. So I'm going to keep going. Okay, so let's look at the situation. So what we're going to have in the Webauthn situation is we're going to have 3 parties. We have the actual thing you're trying to do your MFA to, let's say the identity provider. We have Alice, and then we have Alice. So Alice has a web browser and she has her authenticator, okay? Now, the cool thing about Webauthn, and the thing that Webauthn does differently from all the other technologies that we've looked at so far, is that in Webauthn, the browser and the authenticator have a direct line of communication to each other. They communicate directly to each other without using the internet, okay? That is the one key difference of how this works than what we looked at before. If you remember TOTP, there's no tie between, you know, these codes on my phone and my web browser when I'm logging into something. If you remember, like, like push-based MFA or phone call-based MFA, there's no binding between the browser and my authenticator device, right? But in Webauthn, there is, okay? And they're not using the internet to do this. So what happens is we have this, this authenticator. This authenticator, instead of having a secret, asymmetric shared key, what they do is they have what's called in cryptography an asymmetric key. So there's a public-private key pair that is chosen and stored on the authenticator. The authenticator has the secret key, and the public key is shared with whatever you're authenticating to, right? So if you're authenticating, let's say, to your Google IDP, you'll have a secret key on your phone or on your hardware key, and your identity provider, Google, would have the public key. Okay, that's the setup. Now, the trick with Webauthn is that we're actually using the magic of TLS. So just to remind you, what is TLS? TLS is the protocol that HTTPS runs on. It's the, let me just stop here. Do you see this little, see the little lock on my browser? That's telling me that I'm speaking HTTPS over TLS. So TLS is the protocol that ensures that I am talking really to Google, you know, and it uses certificates to verify that actually, you know, these are Google Docs. I'm actually talking to Google Trust Services. This is google.com that I'm visiting and not an adversary's website, right? So TLS is the protocol that actually just makes sure that I can speak to the real website and not to an adversary impersonating the real website. So what Webauthn does is it actually uses TLS in a really strong way. Okay, so let's see how it does this. Here we go. So whenever a user wants to log in, what happens is let's say in this case, the IDP, the identity provider, is going to send to the browser a challenge. A challenge is just like a random number. It's going to send a challenge to the browser that it's going to say, if you want to prove that you're Alice, I'm going to ask you to sign this challenge. You're going to produce a digital signature using your secret key on this challenge. So that message goes to the browser. Now, what does the browser do? The browser does something very important. It says, I speak TLS to this website, right? The little lock on the screen. I'm speaking TLS to this website. And so I'm going to use TLS to make sure that this is really the identity provider, right? And not some kind of phishing website or adversarial website. Am I really talking to google.com, or am I talking to someone who's trying to impersonate google.com? That's what TLS does, okay? So the browser will say, okay, I got this message. There's a request to authenticate Alice. It came from the IDP. Is this really the IDP? Check TLS. Yes, it's the IDP. Great. So now it says, okay, authenticator, I have verified for you that I am really talking to the IDP. I have verified this for you because I speak TLS to the IDP. I speak the secure, you know, protocol that basically runs all of our web browsers and web security. And it says to the authenticator, okay, this is really the IDP. Please do your authentication thing. You should really go ahead and do this. And so the authenticator says, great, the browser has verified for me that it's really talking to the IDP. I'm going to take my secret key. I'm going to sign the challenge. I'm going to send the signature over back to the browser. And the browser will say, here you go, IDP, here's Alice's signature. Using the public key, you should be able to verify that this is a real signature, and this means that this is really Alice, okay? So what's happening here is that the browser is proving that it can speak directly to a piece of hardware, maybe a phone, maybe a hardware key, that is storing the secret key that can produce signatures on the challenge, right? And what the browser is doing is it is proving to the phone that he's really actually getting this request from Google and not from the IDP, and not from some adversary pretending to be the IDP, okay? So the key things here are that browser TLS makes sure that the authenticator is actually talking to the real entity that's supposed to be asking for the MFA. And then the authenticator talks to the browser directly, and so there's no trickery about where this request came from, right? And so the reason that this stops phishing, right, is because if you actually get a request to your phone if you actually get a request to start to approve an MFA or to put in a code or do anything like this, right? You know you're really talking to the real site that you're logging into. If this was cloudflareokta.com, right? the browser would say, if this was an adversary and it was cloudflareokta.com, that adversarial website, then what would happen is that this thing would go and say, okay, I need to find the public key for cloudflareokta.com. I've never heard of cloudflareokta.com. I don't have anything to send here. There's no MFA that I can do, because the browser would know that it's talking to an adversary and not actually the real website. And this is the reason that it stops phishing. It's because the browser is checking that it's talking to the real website. And so you can't, get in the middle, man in the middle of this and replay the credentials to the, from the adversary to the real website. Okay. So that's the key reason that it stops phishing. And then in terms of MFA fatigue, right? The issue is that the authenticator is talking directly to the browser and not to the internet. Right. And so the only way that you can get a push notification or something that would cause you to actually do the MFA accept is if your browser actually is on a site that you've actually logged into, the actual browser, not some adversary's browser somewhere out on the internet. And so that way you can't actually just get random push notifications to your phone that you will eventually approve as part of a fatigue or social engineering attack, right? So the whole point is that there's a very tight bounding between what you're doing on the browser, the actual website that you're talking to, what you're doing on the browser, the actual website that you're talking to, and the hardware key or the device that is doing the approval, right? And the last thing that I would say about this technology, this is the Webauthn technology. The last thing I'd say about this technology is everybody thinks about this as hardware keys. You don't actually need a physical hardware key to do this. You can use things like Windows Hello, which is baked into your laptops. And there's some equivalent, I forget what it's called, in Linux or Macs that you can use, but I'm very familiar with Windows Hello that you can use. You don't have to have a physical piece of hardware, like a Yubikey, to do this, to make this work. There are all different ways to do this. Like, for example, Akamai has a technology called Akamai MFA that actually will do Webauthn to your phone. And I actually don't know yet how the phone and the browser communicates. I'm actually still waiting to understand exactly how that works, but any way that they can communicate would work here, right? As long as they're not talking over the internet. Generally speaking, the way that it works with something like Windows Hello or Yubikey is they're actually talking through the computer, right? They're not actually going out through the internet. This is the key thing. So that is so cool, right? Isn't it? And this is where we're all going. I think you can all understand why we're going in this direction. The last thing that I wanted to say, right, is that the downside of Webauthn is that it's new. We're still trying to figure it out. I don't know how many people can even explain Webauthn to you in this way or would explain it to you this way, but I stand behind this, by the way. I haven't seen anyone really explain it this way, but I think it's really awesome. But hardware keys can be annoying. It can be hard to deal with a key that's inside my laptop, and what happens if my laptop gets stolen or someone smashes it? Like, how am I going to log in? Like, all of the actual mechanics and the operationalization of Webauthn, I think we're still trying to figure out as an industry. Okay, but what I wanted to do in this talk, and at BastionZero as well, this is something that we're working on as well. But what I want sort of the community to think about is that we've seen the failures of these earlier technologies, and that moving to Webauthn should help, but it's still a bit of a question of the right way to operationalize this. So hopefully, at the end of this year, I could come and give you a talk on the right way to operationalize at Webauthn, but that is what we're figuring out right now as an industry. And I think that adversaries have caused us to accelerate in this direction. Okay, one more last thought. So, I just want to kind of, I think a lot about MFA. I mean, one of the things that we do here at BastionZero is we work on how do you securely grant access to backend infrastructure. And one of the nice things we do for you is make you not have to worry about what MFA tech you're going to use, because we would take care of that for you. One final thought I wanted to share, and something that we think a lot about, is Webauthn. How is Webauthn different from FIDO2? I want to mention they're the same. There's a lot of names. I think there are slight differences. I don't know that I could tell you what they are. But they're pretty similar. So sometimes people say Webauthn, sometimes people say FIDO2, sometimes people say Yubikey. What I will tell you is that Yubikey is not the only way to do this. You can do this with other things. Sometimes people just think that the only answer here is Yubikey, and that's not true. Okay, there are other ways you can do Webauthn. You can do it with Windows Hello. You can do it with something like Akamai MFA. There are all different techniques out there. Okay, it doesn't have to be Yubikeys. It doesn't have to be hardware keys. But you do have to make sure that your browser and your phone are communicating without using the internet. That's the important thing. So you can imagine all different ways of doing that: Bluetooth, QR codes, God knows what. And I haven't seen all the different ways that people are doing this yet. It's still kind of being figured out, I think, in the industry. Okay, so who is your MFA provider? Just last thing I wanted to say. You know, one of the things that we think about a lot at BastionZero, another thing that you may have seen over the last year, there have been quite a lot of attacks on identity providers lately. In particular, there were several breaches of Okta last year. And so, you know, generally speaking, one of the good ways to get MFA is to do it through your identity provider. You can do it through your identity provider. But I want to go back to something that happened last year when Okta was breached. There was actually, I should have included this in my slides. There was a tweet from the CEO of Cloudflare. And it was said that, hey, Cloudflare uses Okta. Was Cloudflare just breached? And the CEO of Cloudflare said, no, we're fine, right? And what's the reason that they were fine? The reason that they were fine, right, was that even though their identity provider was breached, they were actually not using the identity provider as the sole source of their MFA. They had separate MFA. They had a different provider for MFA that wasn't Okta. As far as I know, that's what I believe was in that post. Now, what I want to say here is that this is something that you've probably seen in your environments. Like if you've ever built a system where you have people SSO or use your identity provider to log into something, but then you have something like a Linux PAM module on your machines, or you have a separate MFA provider that you provide, what that will do is that will protect you in the cases of a breach of the entity that's actually providing all your login services, right? So the idea is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You may want to look at diversifying where your users authenticate to. And so you can have separate providers for SSO and then for MFA. And actually, this is one of the things that we do at BastionZero. The way that our tool is built is that we use your existing identity provider, Okta, OneLogin, Google, Azure AD, whatever it is. We use that as SSO, and we have our own separate MFA provider that we provide. And so what that does is it provides protection for you. If your SSO gets compromised, then you still have us as MFA. And if we get compromised, then you still have your SSO as a provider of identities. So this is a way of diversifying security and not putting all your eggs in one basket in terms of MFA. And so I think I've come to the end of what I had to say. I know there's a lot of questions. So let me take a breath here and be happy to answer questions about any of this.
Yes, thank you for this talk. This was excellent, and we will start going down the questions shortly. If you're interested, the results of the poll were pretty much evenly split. So half of all people had kind of heard of these and half hadn't, which is quite surprising. But the questions are in the QA section. We can perhaps start with Anders' question of what prevents an adversary from just creating their own certificate and satisfying TLS when it comes to Webauthn?
Yeah. I know. You're right. Who was that from? Who was that from?
Anders Thorbeck.
Yeah, you know, that's exactly what happened when I gave this talk last week. I gave this talk at Salt Lake City DevOps conference, and you guys are right on. So that's true. We are subject to TLS here for sure. So like the whole security of Webauthn rests on the security of TLS. So like like if we all move to MFA via Webauthn, then we're gonna have to start worrying about like the adversary breaking TLS. Because if they do break TLS and this check fails, right, then we're screwed. That's correct. We're screwed. This mechanism no longer works. So you're absolutely right. And when I had people asking me the same question last week, it's a really good observation that this has been reduced down to the security of TLS. I will say that like logging into things, if you don't have TLS, is super scary, right? Because if you don't have TLS, the adversary can just man in the middle and just steal your password in the clear, because password sent in the clear. So yes, if TLS is broken, we're screwed, but we're screwed in many different ways. So I guess maybe that makes you feel a little bit better, but it's absolutely the case. Yes, if TLS is broken, then all of this falls apart. I think that basing it on TLS, though, is actually a good thing because just username and password is generally based on TLS, and so much of web security falls apart if we don't have TLS. But yeah, you're right, absolutely.
And then we have another question from Anders Thorbeck, who was asking, what is your stance on co-locating your TOTP MFAs with your password inside your password manager?
Oh, that's bad. Yeah. So yeah, that's okay. So I don't like that, right? And the reason I don't like that is because if your password manager gets compromised, then you've been breached, right? Like in one shot. And we all saw what happened with LastPass a few weeks ago. So generally speaking, like for things that are highly sensitive, I would never co-locate the MFA with the password because you've now put it in one place. You've ruined the diversification. one of the things that we think about a lot about at BastionZero is multiple roots of trust and sort of distributing what you're trusting, not trusting one entity. So if you kind of put all your secrets in one secrets manager, it can be dangerous, right? So the idea of actually having MFA on your phone or using your phone as a separate device is actually really smart. Don't put it in your password manager, because your password manager get breached. At least you can assume that it's unlikely that an adversary has actually hacked your phone.
Okay, and we have one further question from Alexi Baida, who asked, how will Webauthn be affected if it's not, for example, on the same Wi-Fi or perhaps unable to connect to the identity provider?
I see. So you're saying that the authenticator cannot reach the identity provider? I would say that you just couldn't log in if you can't. If this link here is broken because there's no communication, I would say that you wouldn't be able to, if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, this channel here is not using something like the internet. It's usually using like running through your computer, right, inside your computer, because it's like Windows Hello, which is a chip on your computer, or the hardware key, which you plug into your computer, then it's running through your computer. Or if it's actually going to your phone, it typically will use I think it can use things like QR codes or Bluetooth, but it's not using the internet. So.
But could this then be used to, for example, force a switch to some kind of other, for example, the one-time passwords, or could this be then to use maybe to shift down a priority?
Yeah, it's a downgrade attack. So that's a really good question. So something that I always think about as a security researcher is downgrade attacks, right? So if you've ever used, and this is so annoying, by the way, so you may have a system that, so for example, Duo does this, where you can choose phone-based MFA, or you can choose something like a push-based or hardware-based, which is more secure than phone-based MFA, right? But the thing is, the fact that they give you all three options is the problem, because if the adversary is able to steal your phone number, right, they'll just select the option that's MFA via your phone number, and who cares about the fact that you have, TOTP or some kind of stronger mechanism in place, right? So downgrade attacks are always there. And so, I think when people design these systems, they're always making decisions of what can we make that's usable and functional for the average user, and what can we make that's more secure? And so if you do have options on this list that are less secure, then an adversary will just attack the least secure one, right? And so again, what we do in a commercial system is very different than what we would do into protecting our backend infrastructure or protecting our GitHub repos, right? Because these are highly skilled people, they're engineers, you can ask more of them in terms of authentication, right? And that's where this stuff comes into play. I don't think that consumers will be using Webauthn to log into their banks in 2023. That's not going to happen.
Okay, and that covers all the questions we had. So I'd just like to thank you for joining us, giving this talk. It was excellent to hear this approach to MFA, and quite surprising that so many people hadn't heard of these breaches given the profile of them. So thank you for joining us, Sharon. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thanks, everyone. Really, really great to be here. Thank you. If you want to reach me, by the way, my information is here. We are at BastionZero. If you ever want to talk about MFA, security, backend infrastructure access, CI/CD, eager to hear from you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hi, we're from Ethico, the proud organizer of the DevOps conference.
Our goal is to uncover cutting-edge talks, emerging ideas, and DevOps trends, providing a global forum for practitioners and decision-makers to learn and grow.
We would love to also explore how we can help you excel in DevOps together. Visit us at ethico.com and enjoy the inspiring talks at the DevOps conference.